Josh Brown, ray tracing is a myth.
No, it isn't. No, you cannot come at me with these conspiracy theories at the start of this, Scott Tilford. Ray tracing is good, actually.
4 times, apparently. 4 times the light in a level, is it? The ongoing conversation around PlayStation 5 Pro is the biggest thing in gaming right now, as to whether or not it is viable, and the idea of a half-step system, the idea of what would Sony need to put out there to encourage you to spend £700/$700, and the idea that at least they're saying is that you would have some sort of line being walked between fidelity modes and performance modes, a PS5 Pro mode that would just play games as well as possible, and it would all just work. You wouldn't have to think about this stuff anymore. However, according to The Verge, there's a bit of a revelation here. Sources familiar with Sony's plans tell The Verge that Sony is asking developers to create a new PlayStation 5 Pro exclusive graphics mode that combines Sony's new PlayStation Spectral Super Resolution, PSSR, upscaling to 4K resolution with a 60 FPS frame rate and ray tracing effects. So far, so good. This is what they mentioned in the technical showcase. While Sony wants this new mode in games, the PlayStation 5 Pro Enhanced label will still be available for a variety of other scenarios that include 30 FPS games. Developers have the option of increasing the target resolution for PlayStation 5 Pro games that run at a fixed resolution on PS5, or even increasing the target maximum resolution for games that run at a variable resolution on PS5. So we're already getting a little bit shaky, because at least for me, I thought we were paying a stupid amount of money for frame rate problems to go away, or just get rid of 30 FPS. That could mean we see PlayStation 5 Pro enhanced games that run between 1080p and 1440p resolution at 30 FPS on the base PS5, then run at 1280p and 2160p on the PS5 Pro at the same frame rate. A fixed resolution increase from 1440p to 2160p would also qualify as a PS5 Pro enhanced game. Lastly, developers could also choose to enable ray tracing effects and get the PlayStation 5 Pro enhanced label without improving resolution or frame rates. If a developer wants to target 60 FPS instead of 30 FPS with the same resolution, this may also qualify as a PS5 Pro enhanced game. Now, if I spend £700 or $700 on a console that was supposed to solve a problem like this and it didn't, I think I would be violently ill.
Well, Scott, the issue is there are lots of different problems that you've pointed out there. Yes. I personally don't think that 30 frames per second gaming is ever going to go away. And that's because for as good as the technology is going to get, for as many innovations and revolutions that we have in building consoles and building games, you are always going to get some developers, you are always going to get some publishers who prioritize graphical fidelity over performance. Yes. Whether that is what the consumer wants or not, who knows? I mean, Mark certainly said in that presentation that 2/3 of players choose performance, but a huge amount of casual players especially, like to see graphics improve, like to see those jumps. And I think because of that, because of the prioritization that is entrenched right now about increasing, the ray tracing qualities of games, that will always come at the sacrifice of performance. So you're always going to see developers skew one way or the other. People who are willing to sacrifice fidelity for that performance are people who would just want to keep pushing the other side. And I think that is a problem that we're always going to have, because if you want the highest quality ray tracing in your game, that's got to come at a cost. I don't think we're ever going to be in a situation where we have unlimited computational power to get everything we want. I mean, even the highest NPCs don't have access to everything unless you're willing to pay thousands and thousands of dollars in some case. That said, I'm not saying this is excusable here, because like you mentioned there, Sony has, at least in the first presentation for the PS5 Pro, seemingly sold it entirely on this promise that it will be the best of both worlds, that you will be able to play games in 60 frames per second with at least a high amount of visual fidelity, not quite full quality mode fidelity, because it is only, what did they describe it as? It was fidelity-like. It was a lot of, buzzwords that gave them a lot of leeway to say it's going to be looking good, but maybe you're not going to get the exact best of both worlds. But that is a problem with the messaging for this, because it is a lot of money, and if people are buying it on the assumption that, everything is now going to be 60 frames per second, Grand Theft Auto 6 is going to have all the bells and whistles and hit 60 frames per second, that's probably not going to be true. And truthfully, it's probably not even going to be true when the PS6 comes around.
That's the thing, right? I hate where this wing of gaming is at. I get that there are the tech enthusiasts, there are the people who love breaking this stuff down. I love a Digital Foundry video as much as the next guy.
I do as well.
But oh my god, I mean, the thing is, their sell here of just like, you can pay to make the problem go away is something that made me prick up, at least across most of the technical showcase, until said price was then £700, to which I said, that's ridiculous, Mr. Sony. I can't possibly cough up that much money for a better frame rate. However, my hatred of this wing of gaming right now is that we never get the optimum vision of the developers. We always get some version that's out there. And me and Josh have talked a lot about it on the podcast that we do. You can go subscribe to the What Culture Gaming podcast.
I'm going to talk about it more right now.
As well, you should. But it feels like this ongoing idea of like, we're going to give the developers the best hardware possible. They're going to fulfill these visions. They're not going to sacrifice frame rates or resolutions. It's going to be the most beautiful thing ever. And then you get out there the reality of each developer going, well, actually, we're not necessarily going to be able to do that. Or we are going to aim for absolute quality visuals over frame rates. Anything that's going to be multi-platform is going to have a hard time trying to square off marketable visuals and the best look for their game when they're matching it on Series X and then PS5 Pro. I guess you could do a PS5 Pro trailer or something, but it's still, that's part of that wider conversation of how do you actually maximize this technology. And to that end, mentioning GTA 6, it would take Rockstar, they would have had to have known about this for at least a considerable chunk of time across the last year or so or whatever to make a PS5 Pro version of GTA 6. Now there's a rumor doing the rounds that Sony have locked down the marketing for GTA 6 in regards to the trailers and things across the next year or so. But still, it's going to take the developers choosing to do this. And that quote about how the things that qualify a PS5 Pro enhanced game could just be ray tracing, which doesn't exist, is enough of a thing to make me worry about the Ubisofts, the Bethesdas, the whoever's out there who just go, no, it's PS5 Pro enhanced. But when you drill it down, it's just slightly better lighting.
Yes, and slightly better lighting is sometimes really good, Scott. I want to go back to something you mentioned, and you're not going to like it. You're going to push back. It's going to result in an argument and maybe possibly a fist fight.
We do a podcast called The Wind Up every Monday, which you should go subscribe to for more moments like this.
You mentioned there that idea of, what is the developer's optimized vision for the game.
Yes.
I would argue that doesn't exist and never really has, and has always been a little bit of a fallacy because I don't think you can ever hit that baseline or execute a vision to that extent to one kind of perfect idea of what a game should be, because PCs have always existed. As console players, we can, say that, a PlayStation 2 game was optimized for the PlayStation 2 and was the developer's vision, but how do we then square that with a PC version that even at the time was running with a higher frame rate, better textures, and better features? You know what I mean? That is where I kind of struggle with that idea, because developers have always had to make games if you're a third party, especially for multiple different machines with multiple different capabilities. So for me personally, I don't ever think that there is this one perfect idea that would fit every single console that they could even execute on. For me personally, I had a better explanation for that in my head and I've sort of mangled it there. But I guess the point is that there's always going to be technical differences between games.
Yes.
And for me, I just don't think that we'll ever be in a situation where they'll be able to execute exactly what they wanted to do and it will be the same across the board, unless you're a first-party studio.
No, I guess that's the crux, is that the crux here, the reason that this video exists is that idea of what are you buying with the PlayStation 5 Pro, the idea being that a $700, £700 price tag would solve everything. But it does bump up against the reality of gaming being an increasingly, tech-focused industry. It always has had one foot in the tech space, but now that we're getting half-step consoles every 2, 3, 4 years, you do have almost the PC mentality of you're buying a new graphics card with this thing, and then you're letting the developer, you should be, if you're buying in, be happy with, okay, let's see what they can do with this thing, and if that results in multiple graphics modes, then sweet. I'm definitely way more down the road of I want you guys to crank it as much as possible, but because you're aiming at a specific SKU, the counter to the PC thing you mentioned there is the PC space has always been so much more modular than an individual console. Consoles existed to solve that issue, at least over time, and especially in the gaming space. And so when you have a specific thing to aim for it and give me the most optimized product possible. Look at Astrobot, look at From Software's output, whatever. Like, they're nearly always specific titles with specific executions, and I wish that was across the board, rather than faffing with settings and paying more money to try and make the issue go away.
I know where you're coming from, and I think the PC comparison is very apt, and I don't want it to be misconstrued that I'm kind of coming in and defending the PlayStation 5 Pro and saying everything is okay, actually, you should go out and buy this, and if you don't, you are terrible and a terrible person. Not what I'm saying at all. $700 and pounds is way too much money, I think, for a half-step console. I'm in the same boat you are, where I was enjoying what they were saying about the machine, and then they dropped the price, and I thought, absolutely not, no chance in hell. Even though I do want that dream of 60 frames per second and 4K. However, what I'm getting at here is that in comparison to a PC that is trying to achieve something similar from a specs and tech side, I do understand the explanations that I've seen when I've been reading online since it was announced, that if you want a game to run at 4K 60 with all the bells and whistles, that is incredibly tough to even get on the high-end PCs that cost way more than this thing does.
Right.
So from that perspective, I understand, but should we be getting in the realm where we are directly comparing consoles to PCs? That seems like uncharted territory.
Oh, it definitely is.
For us, if you're a PC player, you can just be looking at this and saying, well, you might as well get a PC. You might as well spend that extra money. But we've never really had to make those comparisons before, because consoles have kind of existed in their own ecosystem, and it's only really this generation that we have started getting the options that you mentioned, and we have started thinking about consoles and their specs and the options that we have available in terms of, essentially PC light options, because you get way more over there, of course.
No, man, massively. Like, I mean, the rise of Digital Foundry, the rise of, obviously they've been going for a while, but the rise of those videos where one of the first things a lot of people do is check out the Digital Foundry side-by-side video. They do immaculate work over there. But that's the thing, you almost need those side-by-sides to convince you that the new thing is worth it. And one part that was coming out of the PlayStation 5 Pro showcase was all those side-by-sides that were shown, just you're squinting to try and see what the hell the difference even is. Unless you zoom all the way into the background and be, that crowd member in the distance is better detailed or whatever. And I think that's where we're at with the industry overall, and that just is so fundamentally less satisfying than the bigger leaps that were made in the past. But the fact that we have the half-step stuff and the PC, invoking those comparisons, I don't know, I think they're a harder sell overall, and then you're falling back on things that are just not going to be as wowed or not going to be as worthwhile next to the price point. I did want to throw in, obviously the last time Sony did this was the PlayStation 4 Pro back in 2016, and we did there's an update from Sakana's Matt Piscatella talking about PlayStation 4 Pro sales next to PS4, and in the US, Piscatella says the PlayStation 4 Pro only accounted for 13% of total lifetime PS4 unit sales and around 15% of total lifetime dollars. So this is very much a luxury product for someone who, has the money, wants to get the most out of their games. I think the crux for me is that it sucks that you can't guarantee any of it. You absolutely can't guarantee that even if you do spend this money, you will get a PS5 Pro version of a game that does everything. The one thing I was going to say before when you were mentioning 4K and talking about console specs is that that's an industry issue. To me, that's an industry marketing issue. They're the ones who got out there and said 4K resolutions, 60 FPS, this is what we're aiming for, and then struggled to hit it. It was Sony putting the 8K logo on the PlayStation 5 box. Those expectations are set by the industry, and I'm using a homogenous approach to the industry. We're talking about hundreds of developers and studios, but I think that comes from the industry side and not the fan side, which is another bigger debate, whether or not fans were asking for that stuff first. PC gamers definitely were, but it's a PC mentality that has now crossed over to consoles, and the consoles can't keep up. And I think that in itself is a fascinating reality of where we're at with all this stuff.
Like you said, there's so many developers, so many publishers, and the consoles now are more modular than they've ever been. They are more PC-like in their infrastructure than they have ever been, and we have just seen, developers prioritize different things. I think Sony can promise what they want and they can get the messaging out there, but there's nothing to stop individual developers using the Pro technology to define to themselves what a Pro version of their own game looks like. And to an extent, I personally never expected anything different, but it does come down to that messaging of what did the wider populace, who is the target audience for this, expect? Are they wanting a PS5 Pro that every developer sort of treats the same and has the same benchmarks for? Or are there people out there who kind of want, I don't know, Rockstar, for instance, to go all in on ray tracing at the expense of frame rates, or vice versa with, say, Call of Duty, to cut out maybe the higher end ray tracing and focus on frames per second and maybe make 120 the standard or something?
Or a gameplay idea.
No, well,
playing the video game.
That's down to the developers. I think, you mentioned there that 13% number. That's where my personal understanding of the price comes into play, because this console is not for me, and I thought it was going to be for me. But the 13% number makes sense because consoles usually at launch either sell at a loss or like barely break even. They are loss leaders to get the install base there, to get the software sales, to make sure everyone has the machine that the games that you're selling are on. However, with something like a luxury product like this, I wonder if the lesson from the PS4 Pro sales was that if a small percentage of the player base is going to buy this, let's charge them more. Let's make a good profit on the machine, and let's make it as luxury as we possibly can under the circumstances, because it's never going to be a loss leader. It's never going to have that percentage of the market to justify that, right? So I guess they're looking at it and saying, well, if between 10 and 20% of players are going to buy it, let's make sure we make a profit on it. Let's make sure we get our money back on that investment and maximize that 15% or whatever it is as much as possible. Not saying that's a good idea, not saying that's great for the consumer, but I can see that mentality.
Oh, dude, like that's hilarious, because that's why certain microtransactions are ridiculously more overpriced than the rest of them. That you have the whole idea of the industry targeting the whales and trying to get as much money out of them as possible. I mean, the PlayStation 5 Pro's actual price is $100, £100 more than the leaked price that came out a few months prior. So I wouldn't.
And without a disc drive.
And without a disc drive. That's another. Yeah, that's a whole other thing. Is that if we lock you down to a digital storefront, we'll charge you more. Then you can see the monetary cogs turning, and especially because Sony has not total market share, not total mind share, or dominance, because there's still the Switches in there. They are outselling the Series X 5-1, or it's both series systems combined. The regular PlayStation 5, I guess combined with the Slim, is outselling Xbox consoles 5-1. So it's almost like if you're their money men, you might as well see what you can get away with. There was recently a whole price hike in Japan, revealing that I'm pretty sure the PlayStation 5 now is 82% more than it was back in 2020 because of how many price hikes there's been in Japan and just how dominative the console is over there. So they're getting their bag, but I think that the very vocal dislike of this price point and just how unconvincing most of that technical showcase was does mean something. And maybe they're happy with just a tenth of the sales being these luxury products. But I wonder about the viability of PS5 Pro patches. Developers are already stretched so thin anyway, and how much that affects the core game on PlayStation 5, the thing that most of us are going to be playing.
100%, man. I think it's in a major way optics about the price point, rather than what you're actually getting for that price point. I do agree that, as the market leader outselling the competition 5-1, they can just dictate the price of these machines, especially, and I think it's important to note, that it doesn't look like Microsoft is at all interested in releasing a half-step console this generation. They could go back on their word, but towards the start, they essentially just said the Series X is here to stay. That is their half-step console.
They've
in
got
a way.
There's a 2 terabyte version of the Series X coming out, but that's about it, just storage space.
That's it, storage space. Like, they will have other versions, of course, but not an increase in power like this. So I think, again, by being the market leader without having that competition and that direct comparison with an Xbox Series X, X, let's say, they should call it that. They could just say, well, 700 quid, what are you going to do? You're going to go and buy a lesser powered Xbox? Or you can just go to the PlayStation 5. This is what it is. However, that does bring in that optics thing that I mentioned of. Now we are in a position where I don't think we've ever been in console gaming before, where it feels like you are missing out. And I know you might not be missing out as you expect to be, with 4K 60 being the standard, but I'm personally gonna feel like I am missing out because I am priced out of the upper end part of the technology in a way that I have always been when it comes to consoles versus PC. I understand that for my entire life. The best versions of the games, by and large, have arrived on PC with all of those extra bells and whistles, but I've never had to worry about that in the console space, really, until right now. But when that gulf starts to expand, which I argue it has here, that's when I get a little bit worried, because you are going to create that sense of, well, it's just not quite as good as it should be, and the option is right there.
Yeah, you'll be playing a video game and the frame rate will hiccup, and if it's on PlayStation 5, then the assumption is, well, if I had the Pro, it's probably completely fine. But conversely, if you did buy the PlayStation 5 Pro, to me, just because of the reality of the industry, there's so many layoffs, so many developers are stretched so thin, just trying to get anything over the finish line, chances are it's not going to make the most of the hardware as much as you would want it to for that price point anyway. Let's end on talking about the games, just very quickly. We didn't talk about this in the initial video that we did after the technical showcase, but the fact that the first PlayStation 5 Pro game shown was The Last of Us 2, a PlayStation 4 game, and then Sony went on to show various games that have already been out for a considerable amount of time, including things like Horizon Forbidden West. I think was Days Gone in there at one point?
It wasn't, but it should be.
Various Forests in there, but lots of games that have already been out there, lots of things that aren't new PlayStation 5 Pro games is my overall point. I still think that if you led with something that was only on PlayStation 5 Pro, that would be its own can of worms and conversation by itself. But thoughts on the way they showed this stuff off, because a lot of it kind of just came down to it's a game you already know, but it's a bit shinier. It has the ray tracing, it has the reflections. It's a nicer version of a game, which I just think is a bit of a mind F for a lot of people watching, going like, well, do I need this or not? Like, it just doesn't feel, it feels weird.
That again exemplified this thing being a luxury product for mostly for people who don't already own a PlayStation 5 or may not have played those games over the past few years. I know they were technically from the PS4 era, but admittedly all of them have had director's cuts or remasters for the PlayStation 5, which have boosted things. I'm not really using that as an excuse. I do think they should have had new games, but I can see why they would focus on those first-party titles rather than announce something new, because it seems like they're saving whatever that might be for the state of play, but it did muddy the waters, and it did make it for people like you and I who have been gaming on next-gen gaming since the start of this generation. Like, why would we need it when we played those games to death? I mean, The Last of Us Part 2, man. Like, I played that on the PlayStation 4 to death. I got the remastered version and played it to death on PS5. Do I want to spend £700 to play that thing again? Not really. If it was cheaper, I would of course play it again. But I mean, I'm not rushing out to buy this to play a slightly better version of a game I played 4 years ago.
And a game that we played on 2013 hardware.
Yeah.
Like, there's something so crazy about this. And I don't know where I fully come down on it, but it's like, because if you think of, like Aliens got remastered, it was in 4K. There was a whole thing around but whether or not that looks better or it doesn't. But the idea, the philosophy behind that is that it's a classic movie. It's a really great release, and you've now got the best version of that. And no one really kicked up too much of a stink about the reality of that happening. It was more the specifics of the some of the upscaling techniques themselves. But is that just where we're at with gaming? You pay increased amounts of money to get a crisper, better rendered version of an experience that you've already had. And how hard is it to develop things that are specifically for that technology, because how alienating is that to the wider audience? I think that's exactly where we're at with the PlayStation 5 Pro, or it's indicative of that. Because I look at all those experiences, Jedi Survivor, Horizon, I just go, well, I've already played them. And they look gorgeous anyway. And like making the lighting a bit better or making the frame rate a bit better isn't really going to impact stuff that much. But I wonder about how much that means, if that is a bigger difference to most people.
Yeah, I think we're in a very different place to when, for instance, The Last of Us 1 was remastered. And that felt like a pretty big jump. It gave players who didn't own a PS3 access to one of the best games of all time. But now, again, using The Last of Us 2 as an example, that thing came out on the PlayStation 4 and the PlayStation 4 Pro, so you've already got two slightly different versions then. Then when the PS5 dropped, we got a patch for it, which wasn't a full remaster, and then we got a full remaster, and now we're getting a PS5 Pro version. That's a lot of versions of the same game, and I think it's fine to have that modularity with games. It's cool to keep those games updated in that way. But when you then start tying them to the cost of a new machine, 500 quid for the PlayStation 5 and then 700 quid for this, that's when it becomes different, in my opinion, to television or even PC. Because even with PC, if you want the better version of those games, you're not replacing your PC entirely, right? You're replacing specific parts, whereas in this case, you literally are moving one console to the side to replace it entirely with another. And is that worth the investment? I don't know.
Yeah, and also like one of my final thoughts is that every time I see a game that I absolutely love, like something like a Jedi Survivor, like a Horizon, like a Last of Us 2 or whatever, running better than ever, I just get a bit annoyed that I didn't play the best version of it. Like I don't have another 40, 50 hours or whatever it is to go back through every single one of these games yet again. That's not how release cycles work if you're keeping up with an industry. Not to say you can't go back to video games, obviously. But at the same time, I look at these this stuff, and I go, well, was that the vision that they had at the beginning? Was that what they wanted it to be? And I wish I played that, because clearly these games look more visually impressive. And it is just it's a weird reality of being a gamer these days. It didn't used to be the case in previous generations. It came in and across the last generation with the PlayStation 4 Pro, where you get such meaningful updates. It's why some people won't ever play No Man's Sky, because that game's been overhauled so much and restarted so much. That every time a new update comes out, it's like, well, I might as well do a new save then, and that just makes you stay away from it. I have that default response when I see a lot of this footage, where I'm like, I'd have to replay all these games, and I'm never going to do that.
You know what? We're turning this into a podcast now, but it is very tasty. I understand where you're coming from. I do go back to the idea that gaming has always been like this. Not necessarily in the console space, but it has always been like this, where you are getting iterations upon iterations of the same thing. And that has definitely become more pronounced, especially in the console space over the last 10 to 15 years. But I do think that has always been where we've been trending towards. And you don't have to like that. I don't always like that. But I mean, look at something like Elden Ring. You know, you could talk about that game having a vision at launch, and I loved it. And you can talk about the DLC having a vision, but just like last night, they patched the final Radahn fight, right? So then if we're going off what you're arguing there, does that negate the prior vision? Will these games ever be quote unquote finished when they are constantly living, even if it's a single player game and constantly being updated? I don't think they are. For me, games maybe used to be static in the way that movies or books were, but now I think the Pandora's box on that has been opened for like at least 2 generations now, and we are never going to put that genie back in the bottle. No, for better or worse.
There's a lot of excitement to be had running with that, and be like, okay, what are we going to crank up? What are we going to max out? For the next few months, for the next year or so, with this new piece of tech. Obviously, the RTX 4090 side of things on the PC is like, look at how gorgeous this game now looks with all these new implementations. The differentiation, I would say, is the difference between an artistic choice, like a boss design, a character design, something like that, something that gets patched on a content level, versus the foundational side of it, the hardware side of it, the processing side of it, the guts of the thing, realizing the vision in the first place. But we are very much in the weeds in regards to things that are worth patching and worth paying for. But overall, where the PlayStation 5 Pro is at, I think has been one of the most negatively received console reveals maybe of all time. And so far, at least the updated information seems to be painting a picture of this is so fundamentally optional, it's not even funny.